Good to go, sir. Bismillah. Just hold on. Bismillah. الفاتحة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين لهم بإحسان وهدى إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah. We've been looking the last few evenings at the path to Allah and some of the spiritual wisdom regarding how one turns to Allah in one's life. And we've been looking at this from one of the great summaries of Islamic spirituality, which is the Hikam, the spiritual aphorisms of Ibn Ata'illah, a great 7th century Islamic scholar. And yesterday, for example, we looked at the importance of the company that one keeps and the characteristics of the close companions one takes. And the same characteristics apply even more so to those one takes one's religious understanding from. That do not, he said, لا تصحب من لا ينهضك حاله ويدلك على الله مقاله. That take as a companion only one whose state uplifts you and whose words direct you to Allah. And we looked at how one distinguishes between the companionship that one keeps, those who one chooses as one's close companions who have similar goals and purpose, as opposed to the relationships that one has that are based on many other considerations of family, considerations of being a neighbor, an associate at work, others, all of whom we've been commanded to keep good company with on the basis of good character, of concern, and good intention. Today he'll tell us, in the aphorism that we've chosen to look at, something about the wisdom of having desires, having a lower self, having an ego, having whims. That what is the wisdom behind that? That why couldn't we just be created and say, okay, I want to seek Allah, here I go. Why are there obstacles? And the greatest obstacle being oneself, right? One's nafs, one's ego, one's lower urges. So he tells us in this remarkable aphorism, لولا ميادين النفوس ما تحقق سير السائرين. Were it not for the battlegrounds of lower desires or of lower selves, the spiritual journey of seekers would not be realized. إذ لا مسافة بينك وبينه حتى تطويها رحلتك. For there is no distance between you and him that your journey can cover. ولا قطعة بينك وبينه حتى تمحوه وصلتك. Nor any distance between you and him that your reaching can erase. There's no separation between you and him that your reaching can erase. So the opening of this hikmah summarizes what the spiritual wisdom of the creating of our desires is. There's many levels of wisdom in the creating of our desires. Were we not born with certain desires, the human being would not survive. If we did not have the desire for procreation, the desire for food, we did not have the desire for accumulation of wealth, some people didn't desire leadership, etc. The various ways that we survive both as individuals and as a society would not be fulfilled. Different people have inclinations towards different things, so they strive towards them. When rightly directed, those help fulfill both individual and collective good. But there is an element of a test in it. So the fuqaha, the jurists would say that this is a test to see who will act rightly and who will not. And that's, you can say that's the religious wisdom of the way we've been created. Allah Most High tells us in Surah Al-Mulk, the 68th surah of the Quran, in verse 2, الَّذِي خَلَقَ الْمَوْتَ وَالْحَيَاةَ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ. The one who, it is He who has created both death and life to try you. أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. Which of you is best in their actions? This is the wisdom at the level of our submission to Allah. Right? So the nature of the tests of life, we relate to them. There's wisdom in them at the level of faith, of iman, at the level of submission, Islam, and at the level of spiritual excellence, of ihsan. At the level of faith, the wisdom amongst the wisdoms of trials is that they remind us who is God. Right? Because we know God both through His attributes of mercy and beauty, and through His attributes of majesty and might and lordship. At the level of submission, the wisdom of tests is أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to see which of us is best in their action and response. But there's spiritual wisdom in this as well, which is that, and of course the spiritual wisdom is built upon seeing the tests as being from Allah, seeing the response as being directed towards Allah. Spiritually, what's the wisdom? So that you may know God through all of this. So you can behold God through all of this. And the wisdom, and part of it is that the way the human being has been created is that the human being has been created as part of the test with certain disadvantageous inclinations. وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ عَجُولًا. The human being has been created hasty. They've been created forgetful. They've been created out of a love of the immediate. They've been created such that they're easily distracted. They're easily inclined to their desires rather than the ultimate truth. So in tests and trials, the human being is awakened to the reality of their need for God. Right? Their absolute dependence on God. So their sense of their strength, their ability is shed, that they realize that I am needy, I am indigent, I am dependent. And this is why tests are often the greatest blessing that someone gets, because it causes their heart to open to Allah. Which is why Ibn Arabi mentions from his wife, who was was one of the great saints. He said that his wife told him one day, in reflecting, said, أبت البشرية أن تتوجه إلى الله إلا عند الشدائد. That the nature of humans is that most of them refuse to turn to God except in distress. Okay. But then, if you are seeking Allah, you turn to Allah, the greatest obstacle you'll find is that you have all these tendencies within you that want to go in other directions. The Prophet ﷺ said that each of you is a shepherd and each of you is responsible for their flock. But that flock is not just in our external relationships. You yourself are like a flock of sheep. You have tendencies that are, some sheep are pious sheep. They're wherever the shepherd says go, they go. There's pragmatic sheep. They don't particularly care for the shepherd, but they know that wherever the shepherd's going to point them to, there's going to be some stuff to graze on. So there's others that are reluctant sheep. There's others that are wayward sheep. And we within us have all these tendencies. But the tendency sometimes to refuse to turn can be strong, can be overwhelming. We have desires, we have whims, we have inclinations, we have bad habits, we have misgivings, we have worries, we have fears. All these things that hold us back. And what's the self? When they talk about the nafs, the nafs can refer to who you are, the principle of life, that subtle reality that makes you human. But the self can also be referred to in distinction to the soul. And that the soul is what inclines to what turns to Allah. And the self is what is stuck with its base desires. Okay? So the soul is what ascends to the Almighty. And the self is what's constrained by the merely material. And then they distinguish between the degrees of the self. That the self can be referred to, there's the lower self, which is attached to desires. You have your caprice, which is attached to your whims. When you're considering, it's called the intellect. The heart is what turns towards God's pleasure and the hereafter. And the soul is what is with God Himself. But the self, in the negative sense, refers to all your base desires considered together. All your base desires considered together. And in that sense, so they say, النفس مجمع الصفات الذميمة. The self is the gathering place of all blameworthy tendencies. All those tendencies that hold you back from God Himself, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself. Right? And were it not for the battleground of the selves, the spiritual journey of seekers would not be realized. That the wisdom in all these desires is the struggle. That struggle is what is transformative. Because that's all that's keeping you from Allah. There's no distance nor barrier there. He is closer to you than your jugular vein. The wisdom of the self and its desires and lusts and inclinations and laziness and blameworthy qualities, all of it is that through the struggle against it, you seek God. And you establish that you want, whether you want just to be accepted by God, or to be pleasing to Allah, or you want to be beloved to Allah, you want to be with Allah. It is through that struggle that you find Allah at the level of your seeking. And each person shall have whatsoever they sought. So what is this battle? He says, لَوْلَا مَيَدِينُ النُّفُوسِ, were it not for the battlegrounds of lower selves. Right? Were it not for the battlegrounds of lower self. And mayadeen, the word mayadeen in Arabic is plural of maidan or midan. Yeah. Maidan or midan, in both ways. And in Damascus, and most cities would have had a maidan or a midan. In Damascus, they pronounce it as midan, and some say, that's incorrect in Arabic. It's not. Many things can be pronounced, said in more than one way in Arabic. And so typically cities were walled because they were repositories of wealth. And if there's a whole bunch of wealth somewhere, if you don't have it, you're going to want to take it. Simple as that. They did wall the cities. But there's a whole bunch of human needs that they'd have that would not be fulfilled within the city easily. You have all these animals. You're going to graze the animals within this walled city, they'll cause a stench. Animals make a mess, etc. So you keep there's some animals that need to be in the city. You have donkeys going around carrying things, this and that. But where would you graze your cattle? Have the stables for your animals, etc. That was the Midan, the fields outside the walled city. So originally, Maidan referred to the place where the horses would roam. But then, especially as walled cities emerged, where would the battles take place? If you're living in a city and you get attacked, someone wants the wealth in your city. You're not going to say, welcome, come inside, let's fight inside. Okay? You're going to try to stay in the city as much as you can. And you're going to try to attack from there. So the Maidan was, they're the fields outside the city, but that was the battleground. The armies would come there, and cities typically had 4 gates, one from each side. Some had less. If you're on one side, you have a mountain or whatever, but typically they had 4 gates. You'd have a principal gate, and so that's where the battle would take place. So the Maidan, in that sense, became known as a battlefield. Though they joke that that's in most cities. Damascus had the bad reputation of, because the Damascans were known even historically, until they say, they're very soft people. They're traders. Right? And a city of art and culture, etc., they're known as being very soft. So they said that the Maidan was the Maidanul Qital. It was the field of battle, except in Damascus, where it was Maidanul Istiqbal, the field of welcome. Because any enemy that entered Damascus, they'd say, Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban, welcome. That's a bit unfair historically, but it is what it is. So these battlegrounds, right, are where the war would take place. And these are battlegrounds of the self, mayadeen and nufus. Right? That the self is like the enemy that you fight. But were there no enemy to fight, there would be no victory and no success. Right? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that war was inevitable. The cities being repositories of wealth, there's always inevitably going to be those attacking it. Almost inevitable. Okay? So it's like it's a constant battle. It's a constant struggle. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. Right? That's just the nature of battle. Right? So this is the Maidan. Right? the battleground. And the nafs, and part of the wisdom is that you have forces of good within you, and you have forces that are your enemies. It is all within you, but you have to know. When we say know thine enemy, know your enemy. Who is your enemy? And much of the spiritual blindness that affects people is that they imagine the enemy is other than them. That my enemy is so and so and so and so and so and so hurt me and harmed me and insulted me and did this. Your first enemy is yourself. Your first enemy is yourself. Every other enemy is only an ally of your lower self. Because who are your four principal enemies? Yourself, your lower desires. Right? Your caprice is just a minor ally to yourself. Your caprice, your hawa, it's like it's the sister tribe of yourself. Your worldly inclinations, they're just a partner of your desires. Right? And all the shaitan does, the shaitan is like a double dealer. Okay? He just comes and urges the self along. Right? So your caprice, your worldly inclinations, even the shaitan himself, all the shaitan does comes in and gives suggestions. Right? He's not going to actually fight. Right? He's just going to urge them, go fight or go do this. Why don't you go and pretend you're going to have a ceasefire or whatever the shaitan is urging. But all of them go down to who is, if you say you had one enemy, it's not the shaitan. Right? It's the nafs. Right? The shaitan is a manifest enemy because he urges on your immediate enemy, which is the self. Right? And what is the battle? Right? Lawla mayadin nufus. Right? But what is this battle? Because sometimes it's frustrating. Why is this battle? Right? Okay. Were not for the battlegrounds of the self, the spiritual journeying of seekers would not be realized. The victory in the battle is attaining unto Allah. Okay? And there's levels of victory. Right? That you are accepted by Allah, you are pleasing to Allah, you are beloved to Allah, you attain true closeness to Allah, beholding of Allah. The levels of that victory are unceasing. وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا, and the self and how He fashioned it. فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, and He inspired it both to its vice and to its virtue, its mindfulness. قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, successful is the one who purifies it. Within it you have the army of virtue, and you have the army of vice. That's yourself. That's the lower self. Successful is the one who purifies it, who prevails. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا, and a failure indeed is the one who allows the vice to prevail. That is, but you see in that verse that the success is not in the attainment of actual victory. The success is in the struggle. Because that struggle expresses what you are seeking. That I'm seeking Allah, or I'm seeking Allah's good pleasure. I'm seeking Allah's acceptance. I'm seeking at the levels of seeking. It expresses your sincerity. So it expresses what you're seeking. Your sincerity in seeking. It expresses you're being true. Right? You're being true. Right? So that's the wisdom. But then how do you, what is the nature of this war? Because war is tricky. Right? If you don't know how to fight, learn before you fight. Right? Because otherwise you're just a fool. Right? Because the enemy attacks, and okay, let's go fight them. And you run out, you'll be decimated. So, how do you fight? They said that in general, diplomacy works better than war. Right? In the fight, diplomacy works better than war. Shaykh Abdurrahman al-Majdhub, who was one of the great saints of North Africa, he said, سايس من النفس جهدك وصبح ومسي عليها لعلها تدخل بيدك فتعود تصطاد بها. Right? He said, have diplomacy with yourself. صبح ومسي عليها. Greet it by morning and night. Right? So that it might come under your hand. So that then you can deploy it in your seeking. Right? Literally, that you can then hunt with it. Yourself is like an animal. You have a wild animal, you have to tame it. And then if you tame it, you may hunt with it instead of running around hunting for it. Right? But if you run after it, it's going to run. And it's probably faster than you. Right? That you have to use diplomacy. It's like a wild animal. You can't just run after it, it'll keep running away. So you have to learn how to get it. You're greeted by morning and night. Use some diplomacy. And there's keys to that diplomacy. The self, right? One of the most important keys to that is silence. Because the greatest harm, the greatest expression of the ego and its wayward ways is speech. Nothing harms others. Nothing asserts its own sense of self, etc., as much as the tongue. So silence is the key. Silence except in the good. Right? And that's whoever believes in Allah and the last day must say the good or remain silent, said the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what's the basis? Samt. فَلْيَقُلْ خَيْرًا أَوْ لِيَصْمُتْ. Let them say that which is good or remain silent. And that's the first key to diplomacy with the self. Teach it silence. And then the second, they say, is al-uzla, is to be alone. Right? And they say to be alone, meaning it's not be alone completely, meaning to withdraw from all company that is detrimental or disadvantageous or heedless. So to withdraw from sinful company, from heedless company, from disadvantageous company, from wasteful company. Right? قال بالاعتزال عن سوى المتعال. Right? Said, so, withdraw yourself from all but the Most High. Right? Right? Meaning that look at your life. What are associations that you have that are sinful, or that result in sin, that are disadvantageous? Or if you're trying to seek Allah, then there's things that you might be doing that may even be permissible, but they're in the scheme of things to your disadvantage. So what do you do all weekend? You run around the Greater Toronto area looking for new cafes because you want to try new coffee. That's nice, but as a result, you never manage to go to any beneficial religious or spiritual gatherings. You don't even manage to keep up with family, which is a religious duty. So nothing sinful about going to a coffee shop, but if it's at the expense of that which is of greater benefit, you have i'tizal of it. You withdraw from it. So first is silence. Second, says it, and we're taking from the commentary of Ibn Ajiba here. Second is al-uzla, which is seclusion. But it's meaning here withdrawing oneself from sinful, heedless, or disadvantageous company. Not all. Right? Because it doesn't mean that you don't go to congregational prayer. Doesn't mean you don't go to beneficial gatherings. Doesn't mean you don't keep good company. But if the greatest thing that keeps one from Allah, as we saw last class, is bad company, then this is critical, right? And then you work on changing its ways. And you work on changing its ways, but you begin with what is easy, right? You begin with what is easy. Right? You begin with what is easy, what is sustainable, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said that the best of actions and most beloved of them to Allah are those that are most sustainable, even if they're small. And part of that is to see what can you practice immediately and without difficulty, and if you can get consistency in that, then you can take on bigger things. And they say that's part of the wisdom of creation itself, right? That Allah creates everything gradually and in stages. Even though He could have created the whole universe in one go, but everything goes through stages. Tree, you could have insta trees. What's there preventing? So you plant the seed, next day you have a full tree, day 2 or the same day in the evening you have fruits. There's wisdom. Everything in creation goes through stages and it requires nurturing. That's the meaning of Rabb. He is the nurturing Lord, right? The nurturing Lord. And similarly, with dealing with the self, you have to tend to it gradually. Right? But to know its resistances, because there's some things that may seem small, but it finds difficult. So you begin with what is easy. Sometimes you may need to negotiate with the self. You say, okay, you love sleeping in, but you need to get up for tahajjud, for night worship. So okay, if I can get my 4 rak'ahs or 8 rak'ahs or 2 rak'ahs of night worship done, you can have half a bowl of dulce de leche ice cream. Great. Okay. And that's part of the diplomacy with the self. And that's why Ibn al-Banna, who is wrote one of the most influential works in Islamic on the principles of Islamic spirituality, called Al-Mabahith al-Asliya, the foundational investigations. Ibn al-Banna was in his lifetime, people didn't know him. Seemed like just like a normal man. He was a religious man, just went about his life, and no one thought he was anything noteworthy. But he passed away, he left certain writings of his under his pillow. Right? And one of them was this work called Al-Mabahith al-Asliya, and many people wrote commentaries on it. It was taught and so on. Amongst the commentaries on it is by Ibn Ajiba. And he says, وَاحْتَلْ عَلَى النَّفْسِ فَرُبَّ حِيلَةٍ أَنْفَعُ فِي النُّصْرَةِ مِنْ قَبِيلَةٍ. He said, you stratagem against yourself. For sometimes a strategy may be more beneficial in giving you victory over it than an entire tribe. Okay? Because in the desert, if the enemy was attacking, and they used to keep, like if the desert Arabs settled somewhere, it was dangerous, because once you settle somewhere, you're by an oasis. So you settle down, you've got your tents in the ground, etc. Some other tribe comes and they're on their camels and maybe they have some horses, etc. You're in trouble because you can't flee. So they'd keep people, who are watching in the various directions. Is there anyone coming? And the sand dunes and stuff are quite tricky. Right? So they'd be on watch. But if you found that there's some tribe coming from a distance, and they want to attack, or they want to take over the oasis, or your water source, or they want to just come and take your cattle, what would you do? You'd call one of the tribes that you're related to or close to or in alliance with. But he says, وَاحْتَلْ عَلَى النَّفْسِ فَرُبَّ حِيلَةٍ أَنْفَعُ فِي النُّصْرَةِ مِنْ قَبِيلَةٍ. said, use stratagem against the self. For how often it is that some strategy will be far more beneficial in giving victory than an entire tribe. Say, well, they're coming. Well, I'll ask Bani Amjad to help me out. And that's it. Bani Amjad just starts moving towards us, those guys will just flee. But rather, you need strategy. But part of the realization that a person gets is that this is your first conscious life. Right? Our soul has been living before this, in the world of souls, right? And then in the life in the womb, it was the soul was breathed into our body when we're still in our mother's womb. But do you remember how it was back then? Do you remember? If you knew, that'd be pretty remarkable, right? But we don't, right? But this is our first conscious life. Have you been victorious over your nafs before? No. This is my first battle, my first war. You may have some battles that you've won and many that you've lost growing up, but how do you succeed? Right? One of the things you need to do is to be with those who are being successful, which we talked about good company last time. And secondly, there are people who know what they're doing, who have successfully counseled and guided those before. So you seek their counsel and guidance. Right? And they say, كُلُّ مَنْ سَارَ عَلَى الدَّرْبِ وَصَلَ. Everyone who walks on a trodden path reaches. That's why when we ask for guidance in Surah Al-Fatiha, اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Guide us to the path that is straight. What is that path? صِرَاطَ الَّذِينَ أَنْعَمْتَ عَلَيْهِمْ. The path of those whom you have blessed before us. You want to be on that path. Right? So you seek their counsel. Right? And in that, you also have to realize that it is a constant struggle. The Prophet ﷺ warned that do not be like the traveler who's rushing, right? Because he won't get anywhere, right? He will not get anywhere, and no mount will remain. No mount will remain. And the journey is long. If you're in the desert, you want to get to far distance, you're going to say, okay, let's get there quickly. So you ride your camel into the ground. How far will you get? Not very. You killed one camel, you killed another. Will any camel remain? Any mount remain? No. So you have to pace yourself. Okay? And this is from the counsel of the Prophet ﷺ, right? That seek consistency, be gradual, right? Have diplomacy. So when they talk about war against the self, but it's not, it's like I have a friend, he went to, for a few months, he was in a particularly harsh part of the world. And then he came back to Damascus. He'd gone to Mauritania and stuff, very difficult conditions. I said, I'm so glad to be back in Damascus. So I can have my tea, my baklava, negotiate with myself that, okay, I'll have the baklava, but we're getting up tonight. He said, because my nafs, man, my nafs is like a super heavyweight boxer. I said, why? So if I try to fight it, it just beats me up. Okay? And your nafs, especially in the beginning, will have a lot of resistance. You have to figure out how to deal with it in the right way. And one of the key things in that is to commit, to know who your enemy is. That you have enemies. You have a principal enemy. It has its allies. You have to have a strategy. To have that strategy, you need to seek spiritual guidance. Right? Spiritual guidance. And then you have to follow that spiritual guidance. And we mentioned those 3 keys to spiritual guidance, which are, you need spiritual routines consistently that strengthen the forces of good within you, right? That weaken the tendencies of the self. Because just the discipline of spiritual routines itself subjugates the self. You commit to certain spiritual routines. The fact that after every morning and every night, you sit for a few minutes, engaged in remembrance. When you want to get on with life, or you want to go to sleep, or you want to get on social media, or whatever your nafs inclines, just you hold yourself to certain spiritual routines and you stick with that, that itself is part of the beginning of spiritual discipline. That the nafs, it's diplomacy with the self. The self knows it can't be belligerent. It won't get its way. That's why Imam Busiri in the same light says in the Burda, وَالنَّفْسُ كَالطِّفْلِ إِن تُهْمِلْهُ شَبَّ عَلَى حُبِّ الرَّضَاعِ وَإِن تَفْطِمْهُ يَنْفَطِمِ. Your lower self is like a child. If you just let it be, it will continue to love, to nurse, right? To suckle. وَإِن تَفْطِمْهُ. But if you wean it, it will get weaned. And what is the weaning of the self? Part of the weaning of the self is having spiritual routines. But how many spiritual routines? One takes them on gradually, sustainably, with consistency. Right? With consistency. Routines of remembrance, of recitation of Quran. Routines of learning. Right? With a commitment that you learn in a gradual way, and you learn with the purpose of acting on what you know. So you just hold yourself. You don't say, I'm going to launch a big jihad. No, whatever I learn, I'm going to, again, in a gradual, consistent, sustainable manner, bring it into practice. Right? And that's diplomacy with the self. You don't have to go and say, okay, like when I got to Damascus, I was just amazed. Because you come with Canadian dollars, you go to Damascus, it was ridiculously cheap. Food was like, oh my, this is, So of course, it's kind of embarrassing, but I put on like 75, 80 pounds in 3 years. So hard work. I asked one of my teachers, said, I think I'm attached. I'm attached to sweets. The Damascus. He said, they're good, aren't they? I say, Alhamdulillah. So I asked him next month. He said, make sure you brush your teeth, right? Because they're not good for your teeth. And then I asked him the month after that. He said, don't overindulge. I asked him again. He said, have them once a day. But then asked him again. He said, well, just negotiate. When you want to have it, say, well, if you do this, you can have them. Okay? And then I figured, okay, I've asked enough about the same subject. I wanted to, okay, stop having sweets. Don't touch it, and that kind of thing. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. How do you change? Diplomacy. And different things work. Some things you can leave easily, right? But that gradualness is part of the wisdom of how you change things. Revelation itself, right? The prohibitions of Islam, the central prohibitions, the prohibition against usury came gradually. Of course, now the prohibition itself is final. But the gradual nature of the prohibition, it came in a series of verses. Firstly, it just blamed those who engaged in it, of past people. Okay? Then it mentioned its harm. Then it forbade it. Then it warned sternly against not desisting from it. The same thing with the prohibition of alcohol. It came in stages. Of course, that doesn't mean they say, well, I'll leave alcohol gradually. No, the prohibitions, one is obligated to leave them, or at least to strive to leave them immediately. But the gradual nature of these commands and prohibitions tells us of how change happens. And sometimes something you may struggle to change it immediately. What do you do with it? You commit to change. You commit to change, and you take gradual, consistent, sustainable, likely to be successful means of change. But if you haven't changed before, how does that change begin? By seeking the counsel of those who know. The counsel of those who know. And what's the sign of those who know? That the signs of change are manifest within them. They have the requisite knowledge, right? So you judge their own state, conduct, and character. Are they a person of the requisite learning? What do the recognized people of learning say about those people? Right? Because spiritual guidance is the most sensitive of guidance. Like, you could go, some things you go to any doctor, but a very sensitive operation, and more sensitive than heart surgery is spiritual heart surgery. Right? So you just want general advice about, if you have half a brain cell, if you want marriage advice, your marriage is, you really love Zubaydah, but Zubair's relationship is really strained. You wouldn't just go to any old person and say, what do you advise in my marriage? You try to go to someone who you hope can give you good advice. Although you'd be shocked at what people do. But when it comes to religious advice, especially in general, but particularly spiritual advice, because this has to do with the state of your heart with Allah, you have to be particularly careful. So in life, there's two types of people. There's those who are stationary and those who are striving to journey to Allah. So one should strive to be of those who are actively journeying to Allah. Strive to be of those who are actively journeying to Allah. Right? And to have the highest of seeking, which is to seek Allah Most High Himself. And the greatest strength, right? What makes a person strong? What makes a person strong? Strength is not by wealth. Strength is not by physical strength. The Prophet ﷺ said, لَيْسَ الشَّدِيدُ بِالسُّرْعَةِ. The strong person is not the one who can overcome others in fighting. إِنَّمَا الشَّدِيدُ مَنْ يَمْلِكُ نَفْسَهُ عِنْدَ الْغَضَبِ. The strong person is the one who can control themselves when angered. Right? And in other expressions of the self. مَنْ يَمْلِكُ نَفْسَهُ عِنْدَ الْغَضَبِ. When angered, that's one of the expressions of the self. But by the indication, the strong person is the one who can control themselves. The test of being able to control yourself is when angered, but in other expressions of the self. The strong person is the one who have self-control. They can control themselves when angry. They can control themselves when they have lusts and desires. They can control themselves when they want to do what's disadvantageous. But strength is acquired gradually. Imam Zayd uses the example, you said, okay, I'm unfit, I want to go to the gym. You can't start with the heavy weights. So you begin with banana weights. And other people could juggle those, but you're lifting those up. It's easy, but it gives you a momentum. You feel you can come the next day. Then you take on some more weights. And some time will pass, you never imagined, but you're lifting weights that you never imagined could be lifted. But you're the one lifting them now. Right? But that's how one develops strength. But that is the strength, and that is the way you look at where am I with Allah, that how much can I control those desires. But how do you control them? You control them by recognizing your weakness. You control them by recognizing your weakness. Okay? Knowing your limitation and knowing that you have an ally. Right? You have an ally. Who is your ally in your fight against the self? Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. Allah is the ally of those who believe. يُخْرِجُهُمْ مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. It is He who takes them out from the many darknesses into light. Until you realize that it is Allah who is your ally against yourself, until then, it's a losing battle. And that's why, and sometimes some of the smartest people struggle the most in the spiritual path. Why? Because they become accustomed to having self-reliance. I can figure this out. Anything that needs to be done, I can do it. Simple. Right? They just make it happen. When you come to the spiritual path, you stumble, you fail. You stumble, you fail. You stumble, you fail. You stumble, you fail. And you say, I can do this. No, I can do this. Come up with another plan. You can do it. But until you realize that La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, there's no ability nor power except through Allah. You have to leave your sense of ability. You have to leave your sense of power. And you have to turn to the ally, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allahu waliyul ladhina amanu. Right? And I had that verse, it really resonated with me because I had a very difficult life moment. So I was going to go from Damascus to Amman. It was a major step in my life. Actually, I didn't know how to what to do, and I was kind of... So I went visited one of my teachers, Shaykh Muhammad Qaylish, for advice. And I've talked about him. I've rarely seen someone as blessed as this man. Even 90s, and then when tested, the true proved true. Right? Like so many scholars in Syria, he had to flee Halab, where he's from Aleppo, and he crossed over the border into Turkey. Everyone's like, okay, he's fine. But to this day, he remains at a refugee camp, even though he had offers from Istanbul, from prestigious seminaries and graduate schools and research centers to work there. He said, no, I have a responsibility to my people. And he remains living with them and teaching at 2 refugee camps. He says, until their needs are met, I'm not going to go and seek dunya, nor serve others who I'm not directly responsible for. Okay? And very special person, subhanAllah. So I went to his masjid. His masjid, very aptly, is called Jami'ul Ihsan, the mosque of spiritual excellence. Okay? Although it was kind of in a freakish place, because anyway, that's a long story. But I went in. It was right at Maghrib time. The adhan had just been given. He turned around, looked at me, and he nodded smilingly, and he recited these verses. Allahu waliyul ladina amanu. Allah is the wali is the friend, the protector, the guardian of those who believe. He takes them out from manifold darknesses into the light. And he recited those verses. And it was clear what the advice was. And the second verse he recited, related, in second rak'ah he recited similar verses. After we finished, I thought maybe it was just it's a blissful coincidence. After he finished the fard, he made dua. He got up to go to a corner to pray sunnah. He walked past me, says, Hasalt al-jawab? Said, do you have your answer now? Said, that wasn't a coincidence. I hadn't even told him, because he didn't have a phone back then. Because in Syria in the 90s, if you went by the book, it would take about 20 years to get a phone line. So my landlord one day had come and he said, I have good news. I said, what? He said, I have a phone line now. I said, you have a phone line? He said, I have several. He says, but I have a legal phone line. I said, mashallah. I didn't know what he was getting at. He says, but it's not mine. It's my dad's. His father had applied for a phone line 22 years before. And now he got the slip that you have a phone line. His father, of course, had died years ago. And they didn't even know that he died. Right? It was tragic. So Shaykh Muhammad Qaylish didn't have a functioning phone. So the only way you could go, you just go, show up, and you'll catch him. The masjid officially had a phone, but it almost never worked. And he almost never answered it when it did work. So he didn't know that I was coming, like officially, like out. And but this is part of that struggle against the self, right? The part of the struggle against the self is that it's like a ceaseless battle. How can you win? And you can't. You can't. What you come to a realization is, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There's no ability nor power except through Allah. That you're seeking is not just, you're not only seeking Allah. It's not only, the journey is not just a seeking of Allah, but it's a seeking by Allah. Okay? And that's expressed in the Fatiha. Every spiritual reality and meaning is expressed in the Fatiha. Okay? We say, Iyaka na'bud, you alone we worship. You alone we seek. But what then do we say? Wa iyyaka nasta'in, and you alone do we seek assistance of. You alone we rely upon. Okay? And it is that realization at the battlegrounds of the self. If you're just battling the self by yourself, it's just one consistent struggle and failure. But at some stage you must realize that you have to turn to the self through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why remembrance of Allah is so powerful in that, is that it strengthens your connection with Allah. Because otherwise, he says, that otherwise there is no distance. Right? There's no distance between you and him that any journey can cover. Right? Nor any separation between you and him that your reaching can erase. Right? So what's a sign that you are being successful in this reliance upon Allah, in this turning to Allah? And we'll close with this. One of the great Imams of the spiritual path from the early Muslims, Abu Uthman al-Hiyari, he said, لا يكمل الرجل حتى يستوي قلبه في أربعة أشياء. A person does not reach the levels of perfection, right, in their spiritual struggle until four matters are the same in their heart. They've reached balance with respect to four matters. في المنع والعطاء والعز والذل. Right? That four things are the same in their heart. Being prevented and being given. Being honored and being abased. So it's the same to them. Because these are four of the things that are dearest to the person. Right? Because the person, the nature of the self, it has needs. Right? And part of it, and from its needs, it has things that it wants, and it needs to feel respected, to feel appreciated, to feel honored. So if four things are balanced, then this is a sign that you are rightly directed towards Allah, that you are reliant upon Him. What are these? That four things are the same to the person. فِي الْمَنْعِ وَالْعَطَاءِ. When you're prevented and when you're given. That when you're prevented, it's the same to you as if you're given. Because your concern is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not that you're elated when you're given and you're upset when you're prevented. Because you see the giver and taker as being Allah, not creation. You are not seeking to fulfill your desires, you're seeking the acceptance, the pleasure, the love, the closeness of Allah. And being honored or being abased by people. You did something for a good motive, and people put you down, or people praise you. It's the same. It's the same, right? It doesn't matter. Right? What will people say? It doesn't matter. Right? Or whether they praise you, it doesn't matter. Right? The Sahaba were very careful to be sincere. But then the Prophet ﷺ, they asked the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, one of us may do one of the actions for which that one does only for Allah, but people may praise them for it. How do we respond to that? Meaning, should we hide those actions? The Prophet ﷺ said, تِلْكَ عَاجِلُ بُشْرَ الْمُؤْمِنِ. That's just from the hastening of the glad tidings of the believer. That if you did it sincerely for Allah, you shouldn't worry whether people praise you or not. You should worry about your love of praise. But whether they praise you or not, if this is the right thing to do, let's say a young scholar named Maulana Usman Munir stood up on the mimbar, but his new father-in-law is right in front of him, and he got scared, so he faints. He fainted, and there's no sign that he'll be revived. And there's Amr. Everyone else there is like, oh, I can't do this, and everyone's like that. So now there's something that needs to be done. Should you leave it because of what people say? No. Because you don't care about people's praise or their blame. Something needs to be done. It's the right thing to do, so you do it. Because you don't do it for the sake of people, nor do you leave it for the sake of people. That's sincerity. So Amr gets up and gives a khutbah, and he knows secretly that he's a very good, because at work he gives presentations and they're very successful. He just never used that skill, in anything religious. So he goes, gives a khutbah, and people love it. There you have to look at your heart. You weren't worried, will people hate it or will people love it? You're not swayed by either one. What are you swayed by? What is pleasing to Allah? If it needs to be done, if this is the right thing to do, you do it. And if it's the right thing to do, and you succeed or you fail, they give you or they withhold, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Right? And one of the very difficult things to do, for example, but it's one of the sunnahs that sometimes we neglect, is to ask on behalf of people. You don't ask for the sake of yourself, but let's say, for example, you know that there's someone who is in need, and you assist them as you can, but you know a whole bunch of people who could assist them. It's people who have a sense of self-dignity find it difficult to ask. Of course, you shouldn't ask for yourself, but at the same time, you shouldn't hold back from asking for the sake of another. Would they benefit from it? Both parties would benefit. The one who being assisted would benefit. Would the one who's assisting benefit? Of course, they're assisting someone in need. Right? And in those situations, one doesn't care. Or say, oh look, he's going around just asking people for money. And people will say all kinds of things. People will say, oh, you know, she's, you know what, she does, and you may have a job, but they'll say, you know, she doesn't work. She came back from overseas, and you know what she's doing now? She's just collecting charity for herself. And people say all kinds of outrageous things, right? All kinds of outrage. But it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. Because if it's the right thing to do, and these are 4 things, okay? Because these relate to your sense of self. That in being given or in being prevented, in being praised or being blamed. If these 4 are the same to you, means that you're seeking from Allah. And what matters to you is you're standing with Allah. Right? That's a sign that you're rightly directed. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who are rightly directed, who are more concerned for Him than for all else, and who seek by Him and not by self nor by other. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانِ, we have created man. وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ, and we know all that their self whispers to them. He is the one who's fashioned it. وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ, but we are closer to them than their very jugular vein. But in that, right, in that castle that is you, right, where are the whispers coming from? They're the enemy, they're outside. Even yourself is not, you are not yourself. The castle of your reality, the self does not belong in it. The self is outside. The self comes to you. What is your reality? لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانِ وَمَا نَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ. The whisperings of yourself are outside your reality. Your reality is your soul, is your heart and your soul. Right? And the king of the castle is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we are closer to them than their very jugular vein. Even your physical existence, that is the castle is inside that. Right? You are not, even your body is not you. Okay? Your body, yourself, those are external to your reality. Your reality is you're a heart that has a soul. Right? And that soul, that castle has a king, who's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are closer to them than their very jugular vein. So what do? You turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? That's the beginning and end of the spiritual path. Right? لِلَّهِ مَا أَعْطَى وَلِلَّهِ مَا أَخَذْ. Allah's is what He gave, and when someone passes away, what do we say? Among the things we say, لِلَّهِ مَا أَعْطَى. Allah's is what He gave, and Allah's is what He takes. And everything with Him is according to a due measure. إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. We are Allah's, and it is to Him that we are returning. That is the spiritual path. Right? But it begins by turning to Him. Right? And one seeks and takes the means of spiritual routines, of spiritual discipline, of gaining spiritual wisdom. So we have understanding of how to turn. We seek spiritual counsel of how to have a consistent method of turning. Because there's many strategies that you could have. You can't try them all alone. You can't say, okay, we're going to deal with this. Your castle is attacked. You say, okay, let's launch an all-out attack, but also at the same time, defend as if it's a siege, right? And get the cavalry going and shoot the arrows at the same time. You're going to defeat yourself because you can't do all that. What strategy do you adopt? There's many strategies. That's where you need spiritual counsel and where you need spiritual focus. You can't try every spiritual practice. Say, okay, well, this month I'm trying out the way of discipline. Now I'm going to try out this. Yeah. It doesn't work. You have to have a consistent, proven strategy and pursue it with patience. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who pursue with steadfastness. And the sign, from the signs of the withdrawal of the self, right? Ibn Ajiba says, حقيقة زوال الهوى من القلب حب لقاء الله في كل نفس من غير اختيار. Right? A sign that the enemy, your caprice and your self has withdrawn in that battle is to love, to meet Allah with every breath without having to stir that consciousness. Right? Right? That is a sign that Allah is manifest in your life. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who attain that. But Ibn Ajiba closes a very lengthy discussion on this aphorism by saying, فَإِنْ لَمْ يَجِدِ الْمُرِيدِ هَذِهِ الْعَلَمَاتِ فَلْيَسْتَمِرَّ عَلَى سَيْرِهِ. That if a seeker doesn't find these signs in their life, let them continue seeking. وَلَا يَمِلْ وَلَا يَفْتُرْ. And they should not become weary or lose resolve. فَمَنْ عَرَفَ مَا قَصَدْ هَانَ عَلَيْهِ مَا تَرَكْ. For whoever knows the worth of what they're seeking, considers paltry what they are leaving. If you know the worth of what you're seeking Allah. And what that means, all that you have to leave and strive would seem paltry. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who turn to Him and of those who are guided to Him and who take the means to Him, both of spiritual works and of spiritual counsel, so that one can find a path of closeness, of beholding. And if one finds a path and a guide to guide us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then one should be of those grateful. For there is no greater gift than the gift of being guided to one who can guide one to Allah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to facilitate all these realities in our lives. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions before we close? The reason we're closing in Ramadan for this, because it's very stereotypical to talk about, well, Ramadan is finishing, but the Lord of Ramadan is ever living, etc. And that is true, right? But part of it is that we don't know what we're seeking. Right? We busy ourselves in Ramadan with acts of worship, but we need to realize that your business is Allah, right? That what you must busy yourself with is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And all the things in Ramadan, that's what they're supposed to stir within one. Stir within one, within those asleep, those who are heedless, those who should know better, but they're letting themselves down. Okay? Those who are striving to renew their striving. Those who even attain degrees of closeness, that the degrees of closeness are beyond limit. That what you seek is beyond you. Right? That even when you get to the castle, even when you get into the court, even when you get into the inner sanctum, even if you, when you're with the king, that the degrees of closeness are beyond limit. As Sayyidina Ali said, how do you know your Lord? He said, عرفت ربي بما عرفني ربي. I came to know my Lord by what He made Himself known to me. So, and He gave this beautiful description. قريب في بعده بعيد في قربه. Right? Close in His distance, yet distant in His closeness. And He continued. Right? Right? That you're seeking the Most High. There's no, at one level, He is closer than you needing to travel to Him. But at the same time, He is greater than you ever reaching the limits of closeness to Him. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who realize and attain, and of those who strive to be realized in our love of Him, and the love of those beloved to Him as means to Him, and the love of some action in our life that will make us beloved to Him. That action that will make us realize that the only way that we can seek Him is by Him. Right? And to make us of those who realize that all our actions in reality are simply adab with Allah. Right? They're adab with Allah. It is He who opens the door. Right? And He is the one who makes you laugh and cry. هو الذي أضحك وأبكى. Right? Right? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us a wind of His mercy by which He demolishes from within us all sense of ability and power, of honor and self-consequence, and that all that remains is our absolute neediness to Him, that He fulfills by His grace, and that we illuminate our lives and our path and our hearts and our consciousness and our minds and souls with the light of the gift of light, the beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the embodiment of belovedness, the embodiment of closeness, the embodiment of every quality that is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.